Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion titled Geese, Sheep, and GPAI, Notes on the Coming Commons. We have Fenwick McKelvey, co-director of the Applied Art AI Institute, and Bart Simon, director of Milieu, here for this discussion. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space. We're located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. We're running this event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome comments in the chat, and if you're in the space, we'll get a microphone to you for the questions. And with that, it is my pleasure to pass it over to Bart Simon and Fenwick.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you so much for being here today.
We just unmute your mic, that'd be good. Thank you. Beautiful.
That better? Okay.
That's great.
So thank you all so much for being here today. I can talk less loudly, but I want to thank you for joining us in our inaugural public conversation about the AAA Commons. This has been in the background between Bart and I for a good many years, and so this is our first chance of actually sharing some of our work and discussions around the Commons and the AI Commons, and it's a talk that it's been a joy to work with, and so I'm glad to be able to share it with you all here today. So I'm going to begin, and then we're going to hand it off, and it's going to work gloriously.
It's a duet.
Yeah, it's a team effort.
Team, go. Yeah.
So we suppose you might be here to learn about the Commons, what it is, what it was, and what it could be. But we do not need a whole presentation to explain the Commons. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for defining the Commons as a common pool resource protected by supporting institutions. Resource plus institution equals commons. There, we can all go home. But instead we find ourselves fascinated and frustrated with the concept of the commons, looking at it as inspiration to understand what's happening, especially around artificial intelligence. But finding its version, the version that we want, we didn't get it quite right. And so we want to argue about how our different definitions of commons ultimately must inform what it means to be commoners in this coming commons.
There, camera there. So we're not going to give you Ostrom's definition of the commons, at least not entirely. We're going to discuss the commons and the commons to come, much more playfully, we hope. We'll be talking about sheep, we'll be talking about geese, and we'll be talking about GLaDOS, with a lot of mixed metaphors and references to games. That is because too often we find discussions of the commons sound like we're playing a game of Settlers of Catan. You know it. We gather around some pristine land and carve it up, each player taking a slice to manage. We can compete or we can cooperate, but either way the land becomes a resource in the form of sheep, wood, ore, and so on, for us to exploit or for us to take care of, one way or the other. And you see, once we start talking about those sheep, we'll then start talking about the goose. And then from the goose to the machine, and then we're talking about GLaDOS, you'll see. And then all of a sudden, we're talking about an AI commons, and finally the commons to come, the coming commons, perhaps. Hopefully by the end of this, you will have a better sense of how to trudge through all the commons talk, because, and you should know this, it's in vogue again, big time, and this is a game we cannot afford to lose. Choreography needs work. You can reach over and just press the...
No, it's because Zoom is rebelling against me.
Oh, okay. The sheep.
So Settlers of Catan introduces us to the most popular definition of commons we have today. I mean, it's a game about land and sheep and maybe ore, some of those other tokens you get when you roll a dice. But let's leave that for now. Catan is a board game that firstly have us imagine an unsettled land that, for reasons probably explained in one of its many serializations, up to 4 settlers are arriving simultaneously, 6 with the expansion. The game, in Marxist terms, is one of primitive accumulation, of converting a non-market space into a commodified system of property. Now, before getting to the enclosure, let us begin first with Catan, the island. Is Catan a commons? It is often what we think of when we describe a commons, an unspoiled environment, a lost island. This connection to the environment is important because ultimately it's totally wrong. And so too are commons theory in their vulgar form. Both Catan and some forms of the commons suppose something lost without a great sense of what was. What animals lived on the island before the settlers arrived? What Catan shows, firstly, is a problem with commons theory where the right to subsistence, to human dignity, is a condition of resources provided by an idealized land. And that's increasingly untenable in the Anthropocene. There is no return to a common land, nor ultimately a lost land in the first place. So we need to be uncomfortable with this idealized version of the commons because it forgets the very real losses due to primitive accumulation and settler colonialism. Indeed, the game's continued resonance is part of what Lorenzo Verassi calls the settler colonial present. And there certainly is a self-awareness in our part in choosing Settlers of Catan as being something so familiar to us, as a game that needs to invent an imaginary island to play out the still present act of enclosure and primitive accumulation. The sheep, then, offers us two critiques for the price of one, which I will admit is a great trade, and if anybody's interested, if I ever saw one. Because the sheep also introduces us to what's ultimately the most popular version of the commons, regrettably, Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons. The commons then is not Catan, but Garrett Hardin would have thought so. We can find a Catan work in his infamous Tragedy of the Commons. Aside from his direct engagement with eugenics and planned breeding, his interpretation thinks of the commons as a resource, a clean environment that competition leaves destitute, like that player that takes over all the wheat and ruins the rest of the player's games. And so for Hardin, for the commons to be saved, it needs to be privatized, just like in the game. Surprise, the settler is suddenly the hero again. Hardin supposes that private property, the enclosure, is the actual way to protect the environment. This creates another nature-culture split, something that Bart would have added. But not only that, it turns the problem of the commons into something of property management and resource management. What is needed is regulated self-interest with a rational economic system to ensure and protect the commons as a resource. A game of Catan well played. Hardin's sheep, like his shepherds, were rather docile when it came to expressing opinion about the commons, tethered as they were to their rather rational natures. Well, actually, Hardin never really talked about sheep, just the sheep herders. Yet no one can tell a goose what is in the commons. Now, importantly, we need the goose because the goose reminds us that the commons were very real. And this is quite important. This is not, it never was something of an abstraction nor idyllic. People lived off the commons. It was a way of being as much as a resource. And in these commons, people could steal your geese. Like literally, here's tracking of geese thefts in the late 17th century. And such that theft became something of a pejorative to describe the early industrial commons. Someone even actually wrote a song about it.
We should be singing the song.
Well, I kind of get people to sing the song. Neither of us, like, there's already enough me and you talking to each other.
We should sing this.
It's very somber and good.
The law condemns the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from off the goose. Oh, the law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine who take things that are yours and mine. Oh, the law condemns the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from off the goose.
Next performance, we'll sing that. We could do
Bart's
that.
really keen on that. But there are many stanzas, but it's worth highlighting the two. The law looks up the man or woman who steals the goose off the commons, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the commons from the goose. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and these geese we will still a common lack till they go and steal it back. In the 17th century, raising geese required the commons, and this song is about the absurdity of being arrested for stealing something that cannot be stolen in the first place. The criminalization of commoners who depended upon the foraging geese on the commons to survive, and with the enclosure of the commons, these songs represent not only the theft of geese, but the theft of the ability of subsistence through the geese itself. But since the commons is long gone, our relationship to the geese has been strained of late. Some of us no longer can remember, my ancestors in particular, the Micmac goose, the goose that is gone. And we have a loss of the commons, a loss of women's autonomy and self-reliance, as geese tending was the work of women and something that was actually part of their economic independence, and an active enclosure with the effect of criminalization of local customs and sustainable ways of living.
I rewrote that part, you see?
Yeah, no, it's true. It's
You
good,
like
right?
it?
No, it's my
good.
answer,
Yeah.
right? Like mine had the goose, right?
Anyway,
Like,
yes.
Let me tell you some waspy British thing.
Eleanor Ostrom, another commons theorist, helps us to remember a way of looking at the commons as relations. If Hardin paved the way for the rational choice model of the commons that still survives to this day, then we must credit Eleanor Ostrom with rescuing the concept as a special property of social relations. The fact is, said Ostrom, that there are many examples of both indigenous and settler commons that have been managed and well maintained for hundreds of years. These communities accomplish this through shared rules and protocols, but also habits, customs, and values that help preserve the collective wealth of the commons, that which was held in common. From Ostrom, we learned that the commoners do just fine, and we would do well from learning about their practices in maintaining and negotiating and enforcing the commons. But for Ostrom, what the commons is still very much about resource management. We are still playing Catan, but in a more friendly way. It is from Ostrom that we get the idea of good stewardship, and even some ideas about care, taking care of the land to preserve it for future generations. Ostrom's commons was no less economic or rational than Hardin's, but she was far more mindful of fitting theory to actual evidence. The 17th century goose-raising commons worked for ages, with commoners bound as they were by mutually enforced rules, customs, and culture. Enclosure actually messed it up. But what about the goose in the 17th century song? That's my thing. The goose ignores Hardin's and Ostrom's rational models, and the goose constitutes part of the commons they are all fighting over. We could imagine the goose grazing on grass, watching for goose snatchers looking to pluck its feathers for an illicit Michaelmas meal of his ancestors. Not mine. Its event horizon, though, is no better than the sheep of Catan. Yet maybe the goose doesn't play by these well-ordered rules. Maybe they do not give a damn about these human customs and values. We're reminded here, finally this slide, we're reminded here of the runaway 2019 indie game hit called Untitled Goose Game, in which the player takes on the role of the untitular, nameless goose, causing all sorts of mayhem amongst the humans with which it lives. Well,
I mean, you know.
what's the use of the choreography?
Okay.
Never mind. You want me to go on? The next step would be to perform the goose game, like where one of us is the goose and the other is like, yeah, something like that.
Oh, I had it even better.
What?
And steal his hat. Steal his hat. Steal his hat.
My kids are playing the Untitled Goose Game. It was for all you. I did that
He
last
wanted
night.
his
That was
kid
work.
playing Untitled Goose Game.
Harriet loves stealing the goose.
So it wasn't enough of a clip for that. The goose is the spoiler, of course, the hat stealer of the hat. The goose cannot abide by the laws of Hardin's rational man or Ostrom's social contract, and the commons remains below or beyond the laws enforcing enclosure on geese and commoners alike. The last stanza of the song gives it away if you're post-humanistically inclined. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack till they go back and steal it back.
Just for the record, you didn't sing that either.
Well, I don't know if it was actually a song. All right, anyway, the Untitled Goose game tells us more because for the goose, the question of resource management is moot or irrelevant. The goose is telling us about another kind of commons, the commons as a place in which humans and non-humans dwell in a mutual relationship, not as property and owner, but as a form of life. The goose paves the way for the post-humanist commons, which is all the rave right now, and which has been well articulated by scholars such as Silvia Federici and Isabel Stengers. The commons is that space or place where the mutual acknowledgement, respect, and engagement with the other is not only possible, but in late capitalism, it can be seen as the only space left. So the goose pushes back against enclosure and becomes an activist for another kind of commons. But hold on. Before you get all goosey, we must be careful not to identify too much with the goose or relegate the goose to some force of pure nature. We've heard this already, that nature pushes back against enclosure. The climate crisis is a kind of retribution in this sense. It's a tricky situation prone to conceptual pitfalls and failures of nerve. We might look to Donna Haraway, who has tried so hard to manage the nature-culture boundary through the figure of the dog Cayenne, the companion species, her companion. But no matter how hard she tries, she is continually accused of anthropomorphism and attributing agency to non-humans. You can't speak for the dog, and the dog can't speak. Better to worry about the humans who are suffering enough as it is. But dogs are a red herring, and herrings are not geese. There is yet another commons. All this hysteria about AI taking over the world and the fact that most people talk about the Terminator simply gives away their age. Skynet has nothing on GLaDOS, the kindly helper turned sinister and devious villain in the popular Portal franchise. GLaDOS is the original AI agent platform corporate assemblage that has run amok, resulting in a world that encapsulates the worst fears of Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio. And it's also a pretty good video game. Actually, it's an excellent video game. But GLaDOS is not a goose, and certainly not a sheep. From the first moment of the Portal story, it is clear that you, the subject of a horrendous psychological experiment, live in the ruins of late capitalism without a commons to be found anywhere. It's just you, a bunch of robots for comic relief, and GLaDOS in the ruins of the future. Never mind that GLaDOS is ultimately trying to kill you, which they aren't, because you can just try again. It's a game. GLaDOS will do fine as our stand-in for large language models or GPAI or whatever you want to call them and their ilk. The human-made, unhuman machine algorithm data assemblage still borrows much from the Untitled Goose game that follows it. We're not sure if we'd go so far as to suggest, following Jason Lewis and Naomi Arista, Archer Petuas, and Suzanne Kite, that it's worth making kin with GLaDOS, but there is something more reliably post-human about it. It's not artificial intelligence so much as artificed intelligence. And usefully, it cannot be confused with a pure nature of the goose and even the dog, which are herrings, as we've said. GLaDOS is also clearly not the goose that laid the golden egg. We ponder GLaDOS because we are anticipating a future commons built in the ruins of Hardin's failure and nature's retribution. GLaDOS is our fault in ways that the sheep and the goose are not. There's no way to be wistful about some time or place before or outside of enclosure where everything is lovely. We kind of have to find a way to live with GLaDOS, but without treating it like a sheep or a goose. In the end, Portal is not such a cynical game, and you kind of miss GLaDOS after the final boss fight. We also badly need GLaDOS because there's already an AI Commons. And we are here to give fair warning. The sheep have come home to roost, our goose is cooked, and it's not looking good.
In fact, there are three types.
That was a good line, by the way.
No, I know. The puns are good. I mean, and I want to say, and if you've been following along with us thus far, why would we be talking about sheep, geese, and GLaDOS? It's because these characters, okay, sorry. It's because these characters are actually part of the AAA Commons now. And if you were trying to understand this present moment, what we're trying to think through, it's these characters are part of the present condition of the many AI Commons that are taking place, and part of the landscape of struggle and the debates about what the future of the commons will be. That's partially the stakes here is outlining them, and the goose, the sheep, and GLaDOS become our way of beginning to understand these different types of commons. I'm extemporizing here for you.
Yeah, like totally off script.
I know. Like that. So we're going to give you 3. 4 if you count, but we counted 3. So the first is the idea of the sheep version of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is the blockchain, of course. The organization known as Ocean Protocol, which has been behind the AI Commons movement, describes itself as a Singapore-based nonprofit foundation whose mandate is to ensure open access to the protocol and platform, provide data governance, and encourage the network ecosystem growth, and take measures to ensure that the platform becomes even more decentralized over time. Clear enough, right? This nonprofit is a curious mix of market-based solutions and nonprofit motivations. Its core function sells data assets in a marketplace for machine learning and other AI solutions. The AI Commons as a Web3 venture is actually a coherent business strategy, as trapped in this fatalistic logic of the tragedy of the commons. Faced with the contradictions and the belief that a property regime cannot save the commons, what we now have is an engine of technological production dedicated to its ubiquitous rights regime. The promise of a permission-based blockchain is universal property rights, protecting the commons by negating it, the Hardin version. This brings us to this first AI Common, a literal one focused on developing a system of rights-based data assets on demand for machine learning.
I have this note, it's like Fen speak. This is the Fen speak.
I mean, but this is all true, right? So there's another way, though, of thinking about the sheep version. That's the nicer Ostrom version, where people are focused on an AI Commons that's more like a club. Montreal is the hub for this AI Commons. Some entrepreneur registered the domain aicommons.com back in 2004. But like artificial intelligence itself, the site lay dominant in 2019 when an update launched a new international organization calling itself the AI Commons. The group began as an offshoot to the UN's AI for Good initiative, another initiative started in 2019. And it's been led by and is developing into the AI Commons organization. And what it hopes to do is bring together scholars and researchers here to build a platform, a network, a number of networking synergistic terms, and to bring together an organization. And at its launch, the AI Commons described itself as a platform connecting problem owners and problem solvers, which indicates that ambiguity of the project and how interchangeable hub, platforms, and commons can be. But what's notable about this ambitions for the AI Commons is to create a cooperative, but it seemed to have solved. I think we're like feedbacky. But that serves as a reminder, this idea of an AI Commons is trying to create a resource and an institution to create somewhat of a club, which is the second form, an Austrian form of an AI Commons. Now, I'm going to channel some powerful Goose energy here. And we might imagine also then a wild version, a free-for-all of the AI Commons. And that's the second version, where the goose is loose. And we can find this version actually most clearly articulated of all places in the Creative Commons Canada submission to the consultation on the modern copyright framework for artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. Their submission to ISED consultation was to recommend copyright law should allow unrestricted access and use of protected works to train artificial intelligences at the point of input. A clear response to the debates about copyright discussed above, Creative Commons comment finds itself alongside Microsoft, a major backer of OpenAI, calling for express exception in the Copyright Act. All these purposes and policy positions are actually calling for a kind of free-for-all where the commons itself is seen as an open space for companies to take advantage of. These twin statements demonstrate a convergence of threads of the information commons movements with the AI startup ecosystem to produce a policy consensus that advocates lack protection for common pool resources for the benefit of large AI firms. This AI Commons, in a sense, is a new kind of economic engine because the old models of enclosure can't work. The goose is too wild. So instead we need a version of bordering on outright communism. But letting AI be free is much more predicated on the idea that it is a resource to be managed for good after all. This brings us to our final approach to the AI Common, offering up a possibility of a relationship between human and, dare I say, a demonic GLaDOS, but really a nice one. And AAA Commons here is actually a superintelligence as a public utility. And that's what's actually being proposed by Dyer Weatherford, Clouston, and Steinhoff as a way to remedy the effects of artificial intelligence. The hope that we might be able to build a benign GLaDOS for that fully automated gay luxury space communism. And for all we can tell, this is actually what OpenAI is trying to do. This is the weird commons where AI is released into the wild for seeming benefit of all. The prospect of GLaDOS allowing the platform corporations who already have privileged access to the commons to do an Ostrom. Regulate us, they say, so an unbridled greed does not get the better of us. This is AI for good. But GLaDOS is more savvy to this ruse, so it points to the ways AI might mutate, transform, and contort, as well as how we might make and use AI against the grain.
We need to rewrite some of that part.
Yeah.
But it's
My bad.
all right, we're coming to the end now. Yeah. So the coming commons is not the commons of the sheep or the goose. Those are history. And with them, there's always a great risk of romanticizing the commons into a series of interspersed communes, kind of all Mad Max style across the land, pocket utopias in a decaying world. The new left and the libertarian right make strange bedfellows in the will to hunker down and avoid one another. We don't anticipate the commons ushered in by GLaDOS either. Why does anyone choose this Turing test-saturated survival of the fittest, winner-take-all sensibility anymore? Is it really fear that will drive us to think otherwise about how to be together? And yet, the sheep, the goose, and GLaDOS are calling. The coming commons calls us out, calls us to the tasks of commoning, despite the fear of tragedy, despite the absence of universal laws, the shakiness of codes of conduct, and the impossibility of the everyone gets it community. The commons signals trouble in Donna Haraway's sense of the term. The key is to engage that trouble as commoners, not Ostrom's human commoners, but as some other not quite human, not quite ourselves. That is because we see the AI commons as already here. ChatGPT reveals the possibility of the commons, the internet as common knowledge, and its dispossession of the commons. We can see what we never could once AI is on the scene. So we are then less concerned with the sheep as an institutional approach or the goose's free-for-all approach, nor this idealistic AI commons for good. Though it would be great if it were possible. We instead recognize with the claim that we are already commoners, called to be that by the growing importance of big tech and AI. Our project is not to imagine a commons, but how to live in the commons we have. The challenge of us as AI commoners is beginning from our unagency. That's a Fen thing. I still don't know what that means, but it's okay. To think along with Anna Tsing or Fred Morton or Stefano Harney about the commons as compromised in a commons not made by us, nor one created by institutions we can govern, at least now. The challenge is to find research that seeks hopes and, dare say, pleasures in these AI commons. What are the possibilities to be found in our agencies and unagencies between terrestrial and machine worlds? And so, here we are, beginning to understand ourselves as commoners, not as sheep or as geese or GLaDOS, but something else we don't quite know yet. Needs a beat, another beat.
Okay.
What do we do now?
I don't know. That's it. There's the talk.
Questions?
We did it. Yeah.
Yes,
Do you want to?
We think so. We're on television, we're not sure.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll get this microphone to you.
I loved it. Thank you so much. At some point you said something like, while GLaDOS is our fault, the geese and the sheep aren't exactly our fault. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
I thought you wrote that.
I probably did, yes. It's more our fault. So if we follow Haraway, the geese and the sheep are absolutely our fault too, especially when we talk about our relationship with nature. So that's part of the whole argument, that there is no nature out there, right? Everything is this entanglement of nature, culture. The problem is it's very easy to pin nature on the goose and the sheep as being somehow naturally other to culture. But you can't do that with GLaDOS. It's impossible. And that's the advantage, right? It is an agent which is artifice. So sure, you can talk about dogs, and sure, you can talk about all sorts of other non-human agency, but you'll get trapped in all sorts of discourses around how to understand those agencies. So we're trying to pin a lot on AI's capacity to teach us something new.
And I think, I mean, you know, there was a bunch of versions of this talk, and I think part of the moment we've been thinking through is that there is a lot of activity and a lot of embrace of the term of an AI Commons. And so I think one of the threads throughout this is us using the Commons to navigate kind of the ambiguity of the post-human subject, which is so often seen to be a kind of a sheep or a goose, but at least in other work, you can see that as technical. And that kind of blurring of the environmental and technical is, I think, partially at work here. And partially what we need GLaDOS to do is to kind of remind us that so much of the talk of the Commons is not this solely environment or a pristine environment. It's something that's socio-technical. And that's partially why I think why we're at least kind of emphasizing the GLaDOS part, though I think I'd be inclined to, you know, it's not as though we're trying to say that sheep, you know, is the cause of our woes, or it's just a driver of its own agency, which largely is often towards ovens. But I think that does speak to some of the ways that we're trying to play with that intersection between the two post-human subjects.
Thank you. That was very entertaining and insightful. I want to follow up on this question. Do you think that with AI emerging as sort of like a technological agent, do you think that the human then becomes more a subject of nature in that sense, or does it remain sort of distinct from the goose and the sheep? Like, does it become lumped in with the goose and the sheep as representative of nature in that sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we see those discourses, right? Like grasping hold of some essential nature of what it is to be human that is against whatever is purporting to be the agency of AI, which somehow challenges our humanity. So that's a very strong thread that we're seeing. Engineers don't tend to push that thread very much. It's coming from the humanities and philosophy and other things like that. So this tendency to try to redraw the boundary, we're trying to trace back to the original problem of the Commons. The reason why the boundary was drawn in the first place was in order to create property. So it really goes back to the enclosure and primitive accumulation, but it starts the whole process off. So we are these latent communists, but post-human kind, I suppose you might say. So any attempt to redraw that boundary will meet this complication, right? No, I'm human, you're machine. I'm human, you're goose. We're saying we have to go the other direction, and that's a difficult direction to go, especially when we're dealing with like epically horrendous stories about AI. So part of this is about becoming okay with hearing horror stories and then pushing that boundary a little bit. That's how I read it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, because part of this is trying to talk about a politics in this moment, I think at a high level, and not fall into saying, and that's where the sheep, the goose, and GLaDOS, I think are kind of traps, right? Like those are the ways, not traps, but like politics that we can see problematic. And so I think the call to recognizing us as commoners and to acknowledge this kind of what I would think of as latent commons following Singh is that, you know, we didn't necessarily have an agency in constituting it. That's where this unagency comes in. And so I think that part of that also eats at these ideas of the human theories of empowerment, where it's like what we need to be is humans who are autonomous. And really it's something between that, probably that weird goose sheep amalgam from Midjourney that Rowena helpfully allowed us to create. It's something more about like what probably is at hand here. And so that's part of what I think we're trying to get at is not simply a humanist project.
I mean, it's even bigger than that because the stakes are the commons. So if you're hip to the sort of larger political argument, the only site for resistance left against like capitalism is some notion of the commons. And the problem is, actually, the corporations know that. So that's why they talk about the commons all the time. It's kind of like a last frontier. If they can get the commons, they kind of got it all. So there's a need for a kind of new activism. But the problem with the old activism is it buys in to the old language and simply seeks a new kind of set of regulations and a new set of contracts in the sort of Ostrom model. Right? So we need a whole other set of activist affordances in order to be able to claim the commons against what's going on. So there really is, we want to make it like, we want to hit our beats on the goose and the sheep and the GLaDOS. We're not so sure if we're exactly right, but the beats will help us to tell that bigger, much more like high stakes story. That's what we're trying to do.
And the other thing just to say is that, what we're talking about is quite tangibly real. Like, as much as the sheep, the geese, and GLaDOS was like, I think, a dare between two of us to see whether we could do a talk around that. They are, I think it is some way of trying to at least translate the abstract corporate theory that's at work here. And I think it's always, a mistake to kind of think that the only people that are theorizing are academics. And that the commons and how we're reading the AI commons is trying. And I think in our back and forth, we're always just like, oh no, there's another theory of the commons that we haven't come up with. And I think part of it, if there's an intervention of this talk, is bringing up and trying to get up to speed just what's taking place around the debates around the commons and commoning and machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Hi there. Love to talk. Do more of them. I don't know how relevant this is, but I would like to know. You brought up latent communism or space communism, but you're also talking about the commons. Is there a difference between a goose who's raised in a commune versus a goose who's raised in a commons? And how do those two concepts overlap or not? Just for clarity.
So the goose is important because the historical work on the commons, it talks about the commons as a pre-capitalistic space. And so much of the writing is about, and this is what Marx is talking about with primitive accumulation, is these movements of enclosure. And it's a huge thread in the literatures around that. What's also, I think, important is that research into the commons is, as a historical phenomenon, at least outside of Ostrom in a certain way, can be patchy. And so it is helpful to kind of say, like, well, this commons was real. What it looked like is complicated. And then knowing that was invoked in some ways as communism, and that was part of, I think, some of the theories of where that went. But there was a transference from a real space to an imaginary space. And
they're flips, though, right? So the key difference between the sheep and the goose with respect to the commons is that the sheep will go kind of where you tell them. So enclosure wasn't that bad for sheep herding, but the goose are tied to the definition of the commons. So it doesn't matter if you try to pen them in; their natures are to exceed the boundaries of any boundary you draw. So they become kind of wherever they walk is the commons, right? And you cannot pen them in. And we have examples of other kinds of animals and cultures that build up around non-humans in this way, right? Migratory non-humans and so on and so forth. But historically, in terms of that 17th century song, that was precisely the point. And so he's like, how can you pen a goose? It's like, it's got to go where it's got to go, and then I got to go get my goose. And so now you're arresting me for doing what, taking care of the goose? And that's what that song's about. It's just absurd. And there's all these cases and trials and stuff that get written about. It's very exciting stuff. But at the end of the day, that gets pinned on a kind of nature, right? A non-human nature to be. So it's really important. The commune versus the commons is a huge thing because the commune is a bounded enclosure. It's a place to hide, or it's a place to escape, or it's a place to generate a safe space or something along those lines. But ultimately, it's not a commons and should never be confused with that. And that's part of what the Goose helps the story the Goose helps tell. I'm still not sure if Ostrom actually talked about the Goose. I was trying to hunt it down. And it turns out that Hardin gets always referred to as talking about sheep, but actually he was talking about cattle. So in the original paper, he was talking about cattle herders, but then everybody just thought about it as sheep herders because they were obsessed with what was going on in the UK, which wasn't about cattle, but was all about sheep. Just saying.
We have to swap Catan out for Agricola now.
I know.
We've talked a lot about sort of the raw animality of the goose, and to some extent the sheep as well. But the talk seemed to focus the lens a lot on GLaDOS and like the post. And it makes me think, with the, like you've just been talking about, like the sort of the uncageableness of the goose, is there not some sort of space for a neo-goose, a post-goose goose, in this sort of, I mean, if we're tending towards chaos and true democratization of something that we have to just live with, the goose is kind of right at home there. Makes sense.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
Do you want to go?
No, if you go.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would say we're kind of in the Goose version in many ways, right? I think what we're seeing right now is a kind of a free-for-all, and I think that we're kind of just exposed to it. So, I mean, I think I have a bit more ambivalence about the Goose as necessarily a benign character and someone maybe not depriving my ancestors of their Michaelmas dinner. And I think that of the three is probably the one that the kind of AI Commons is trying to push back against. It's trying to bring about some sort of order because, yeah, it is kind of chaotic. And I think, so, yeah, I mean, is there a way of finding...
Yeah, I mean, I'm for the post-goose goose. I mean, any goose that can resist being reduced to nature, a force of nature, we're in good shape. So the goose as spoiler, the goose as agent that somehow isn't quite controllable, the goose as a form of sort of technological action, which is still kind of open, right, and accessible, and also doesn't take direction very well, right? We have lots of examples of this, right? No matter how much, but the mistake will ultimately always be to attribute that to some other kind of force rather than culture's own capacity to produce, if you like, contradictions within it, because that's what the goose is. It's a contradiction to the normal rules of going on. So we think in even the most horrendous, already captured platform capitalism, evil Google world you can imagine, there are still Geese-like agents. Goosey. Geesey? Gooses. Many gooses. Gaussian. What's a group of geese? It's a gaggle.
Flock?
No, it's a gaggle.
The gaggle geese?
It's a gaggle. Okay. We didn't use any, we should have used gaggle. We will use gaggle in the next paper.
Any other questions, either in the space or online?
Are we answering any of those?
We have one more in the space.
Yeah, I have another question. A lot of this talk is quite conceptual and abstract, and Fenwick, you mentioned that this is all quite real, and so I'm wondering if we can sort of get back to reality, and if you could elaborate on how the AI Commons actually looks in our like four-dimensional space, you know, like what that looks like in our kind of day-to-day realities, and how that's different for different people, because obviously not everyone has access to probably the AI Commons for various reasons. So yeah, how does that look like, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think one of the challenges is that we're kind of like, to me, what I find interesting is talking about that the governance debate, which is not accessible. I think that that's something quite important to stress. This stuff that Maurice and I have been working around, like consultations in Canada, where, yeah, we're not talking about spaces that are accessible nor even are debated right now. And so it isn't necessarily something that people can find tangible. But this is, I guess, the R&D, like what we're seeing is the R&D labs versions of the commons that will be foisted upon us anytime now. And that's where, to me, I'm always kind of fascinated looking at those moments. And so, yeah, really, really tangibly, although it's kind of like Web3 stonks are kind of not what they used to be these days, there is a real overlap between artificial intelligence and blockchain, Web3, and that crisis, so to speak. And that's actually the looming one I see. I just know today that there's apparently a resolution of the writer's strike. And the likely scenario for all this is increasingly a permissions-based society where everything is tracked, and then the blockchain actually becomes the model of that. So, what we could see in the future is something where your citation engine, like Zotero, which I like to advocate, is actually your, preferred system of contractual obligations to produce the work you synthesized, and I think that's very, very much at work. And then there is a second attempt at creating cooperative projects, which is really what the AAA Commons is kind of more tangible, is people get together. And that's where there was a real moment. It's kind of crazy how much things have changed, because when I looked at the AAA Commons that we were talking about in 2019, it became a blockchain company, and I was like, oh, okay, well that was part of it. But there is still an effort to kind of imagine kind of cooperative AI spaces, and that's another AAA Commons. And then the third to me is the one which we talked about, but yeah, most of the kind of classic free software movements, then not the Free Software Foundation, but like open source, Libre, Creative Commons, they're really advocating, the Internet Archive are really advocating for all of cultural history to become training data. And so that, to me, that Goose energy is important because it actually is the end point for someone like me who's really been, always a scholar of open source and free software. It's like, it's the end of that as a political project in many ways. And I think that's a really important moment that at least I'm trying to reconcile with. And then the last one is just, I think, a lot of kind of the political projections of what we do with this AI is based on this kind of public utility. So none of these are something you're going to encounter in your daily life. But to me, that's part of the stakes of why it's theoretical and abstract, because I want to, ultimately held accountable that I'm not doing that. And that's part of why I think it's important, is to go in this space.
And the only thing to add is that in your daily life, there's a lot of commons activism. So we see it all the time, but the two registers are kept separate, right? And that's the danger. So people in their daily lives are in one register of the commons. The corporations are using another register of the commons. Both of them are in danger of missing the mark, right? So this idea to bring the languages together so that one can see the other, and then forge a different path in a way. Because it is part of everyday life now, commons talk. And people are very keen to organize at the level of neighborhoods and community groups and so on and so forth. And they refer to themselves as creating a commons, very much in the Ostrom mode, not in the Hardin mode, but in the Ostrom mode. Some in the Goose, some more sheep. Very few GLaDOS. Very, very few GLaDOS. And that's a bit dangerous.
And the only, this just reminded me of a kind of tangible thing, would be closest thing to this, and you have to squint because it's not entirely that, but what was happening around the activism on Reddit with the moderators quitting. And it's a bit outside the entire kind of AI Commons, but what happened was Reddit changed the rates for API access. And they did that because everything is being used for training data. And the moderators, because they couldn't use the apps, that was a big thread. Like they couldn't use the apps, revolted. But part of that revolt can be read, and I'm sure there's parts of Reddit that were on this, is that what they were about is the way that this company has really turned the histories of online community, like all this activity, into a profit center for training data set. And Reddit, it's interesting whether it will survive that, because there is a lot of communities that have lost their moderators because they no longer see a purpose, because it's actually that form of commodification that really work on Reddit. So yeah, I think it has an effect, and I think that that's something that is a bit rare now, because Reddit is like an older type of web community that was open in a way that all the kind of bigger pushers and providers of this have gotten wise to and would never let their data come up in the commons.
That was good. Got a lot of questions.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much. We are going to go ahead and close up the live stream, but for those of you who are joining us online and for those of you in the space, don't go anywhere. We have activating games starting at 2:30, so in just over half an hour. So we hope to see you there. Thank you.